They gave her a corner of the mountain's heart and expected silence. They gave her their contempt, a blunt instrument of rank and tradition, and expected her submission. They gave her a crisis born of physics they could not comprehend and expected her to fail like the rest of them. She gave them a lesson in the resonant frequency of power, the deep geology of asymmetric warfare, and the undeniable weight of a legend made flesh. In the end, when the groaning rock fell silent and the dust began to settle, it was not the commander's shouted orders or the operator's hardened steel that had saved them. It was the quiet woman, her preternatural understanding of the living stone around them, and a simple tattoo that was a ghost story whispered from a mother to her daughter, an inheritance of impossible knowledge. The air in forward operating base Kestrel's nest was stale, a composite fluid of recycled oxygen, ozone from the server banks, and the faint perpetual dampness of Precambrian rock. It was an atmosphere under pressure, both literally and figuratively. The command center was a cavern, not natural but violently carved, a wound in the granite belly of the Takhar mountain range. Its walls were a chaotic tapestry of exposed gneiss, shot through with veins of milky quartz, and interspersed with the sterile gray panels of prefabricated modules. Cables, thick as a man's arm, snaked across the floor and ceiling like metallic ivy, feeding power and data to the humming racks of electronics that were the base's true purpose. The only sound was a constant, multi-layered drone, the whir of cooling fans, the low thrum of the geothermal power core, and a deeper, almost subliminal vibration that traveled from the mountain itself, through the concrete floor, and into the bones of every person stationed there. It was a place of immense, silent tension, a coiled spring of strategic importance buried 1,000 meters beneath a hostile surface. In the quietest corner of this technological tomb sat Dr. Eris Thorne. She was a study in stillness, a stark contrast to the latent energy that filled the space. Her station was an alcove, clearly an afterthought in the base's design, cluttered with sensitive gravimeters and broadband seismographs that looked more like arcane artifacts than scientific instruments. She wore a set of simple gray fatigues, devoid of any rank, flag, or insignia. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, pale in the glow of her monitors, was a mask of intense concentration. She was not looking at tactical maps or satellite imagery. Her screens displayed flowing, hypnotic waves of data, complex topographical models of the subterranean strata, and spectral analysis charts that translated the mountain's ceaseless groaning into a language only she could understand. To the handful of technicians and analysts who shared the command center, she was an anomaly, a civilian contractor from some obscure geological survey, tasked with monitoring the region's tectonic stability. They saw her as a piece of passive equipment, another sensor in the array, and they afforded her the same level of detached disregard. Eris felt the mountain as a living entity. For her, the constant, low-frequency vibrations were not background noise. They were a pulse. She could feel the immense strain of the overlying rock, the slow, inexorable creep of fault lines, the subtle shifts in hydrostatic pressure within the labyrinthine aquifers below. Her fingers would move across her keyboard, not with the staccato rhythm of typing, but with the fluid grace of a musician, coaxing data from the stone, transforming its raw energy into coherent information. She tracked the ghost-like signatures of P waves and S waves, filtering out the background chatter of the planet's own breathing to find the whispers that did not belong. For the past 72 hours, she had been tracking one such whisper. It was a subtle, rhythmic resonance, a harmonic that had no natural origin. It was too clean, too persistent. It was artificial. It was a threat signature that the base's sophisticated acoustic sensors and signals intelligence platforms were completely deaf to, because they were designed to listen to the air and the ether, not the deep earth. The oppressive quiet of the command center was shattered by the percussive slam of the pressure door and the sudden influx of noise and aggressive energy. Lieutenant Commander Valerius and his SEAL team, call sign Hammer, had arrived. They moved with the loud, clattering confidence of men who considered any environment their personal domain. Their gear was a symphony of clicking buckles, Velcro tearing, and the heavy thud of mag-locked rifles against armor plating. There were 5 of them, including Valerius, all of them massive figures clad in state-of-the-art combat exoskeletons that bulked their already impressive frames. They were walking manifestations of kinetic force, and their presence instantly altered the room's atmosphere, charging it with a palpable, masculine arrogance. Valerius was the apex of this invasive force. He was a tall man, with a jaw that seemed carved from the same granite as the walls and eyes the color of a winter sky. He unclipped his helmet, revealing a short crop of blonde hair, and surveyed the command center with an expression of profound ownership. His gaze swept over the technicians, who instinctively straightened in their chairs, before finally landing on Eris in her secluded alcove. He paused, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. He saw a small, unassuming woman in a corner, surrounded by what looked like junk, occupying space that could be better used for a weapons locker. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice a blunt instrument that cut through the humming quiet. He did not address Eris directly, but instead aimed the question at the on-duty watch officer, a young lieutenant who scrambled to his feet. "Sir," the lieutenant stammered, "that's Dr. Thorne. She's the civilian geologist assigned to the facility. Tectonic monitoring." Valerius grunted, a sound of pure dismissal. He walked over to her station, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete. He loomed over her, casting a long shadow that fell across her screens. Eris did not look up. Her focus remained entirely on the flowing data, her eyes tracking the faint, anomalous sine wave that continued its patient, rhythmic pulse from deep within the earth. She was aware of his presence as a change in air pressure, a disruption in the room's ambient thermal and acoustic fields, but she registered it as irrelevant data. "Dr. Thorne," Valerius said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Valerius. My team and I are your new tenants. Try to stay out of the way." Only then did she finally lift her head. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, met his. There was no deference in her gaze, no intimidation. There was only a calm, analytical assessment, as if she were examining a peculiar rock sample. After a moment of silence that felt charged and heavy, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and returned her attention to her screens. The dismissal was so complete, so utterly devoid of emotion, that it momentarily stunned Valerius. He was a man accustomed to being the center of any room, the focal point of all authority. To be looked through, to be categorized and then discarded as unimportant, was an experience he was wholly unfamiliar with. A dark flush crept up his neck. "We have a mission briefing in the Tactical Operations Center in 15, he snapped to the room at large, his voice unnecessarily loud. "I want all department heads present." He shot one last glare at the back of Eris's head before turning on his heel and striding toward the talk, his team following in his wake like a pack of wolves. The command center's fragile quiet slowly began to reassert itself, but the tension had been ratcheted up, a new and unwelcome harmonic added to the mountain song. Eris Thorne, however, seemed unaffected. She had already forgotten him. She had found something. A secondary resonance, fainter than the first, but perfectly in phase. The pattern was becoming clearer. It was not a whisper. It was a countdown. The Tactical Operations Center was a smaller, more focused chamber off the main command floor. It was dominated by a large holotable that currently displayed a three-dimensional map of the surrounding mountain range. The air was thick with the smell of strong coffee and nervous energy. Valeria stood at the head of the table, radiating an impatient authority. The base's department heads, communications, security, life support, intelligence, were arrayed around him, their postures stiff and attentive. Eris entered last, a silent shadow slipping through the doorway. She did not take a seat at the table, but stood against the far wall, her arms crossed, her expression neutral. Her presence was a dissonant note in the rigid military composition of the room. Valerius noticed her immediately. A vein pulsed in his temple. "Doctor," I said, "department heads. My work concerns the structural integrity of this facility and the stability of the operational environment," she replied, her voice calm and even, carrying easily in the acoustically damped room. "That makes me a stakeholder." Before Valerius could formulate a suitably cutting retort, he was interrupted by Petty Officer Diaz, his team's comms specialist, who the men called Cutter. Cutter was a wiry man whose quiet competence stood in stark contrast to his commander's performative aggression. "Sir, with respect, her seismic data might be relevant. Intel suggests the insurgents in this region have been experimenting with unconventional tunneling methods." Valerius shot Cutter a look that could strip paint, but the specialist held his gaze. Reluctantly, the commander grunted and turned back to the holotable. "Fine, but keep your geology lesson to yourself unless asked." He gestured to the map. "All right, listen up. High Command is screaming about a communications blackout from the automated observatory on Ridgeback Peak, here." A red circle pulsed on the holographic terrain. "They think our local insurgents have gotten bold. My team is going to take a little walk up the hill and find out what's going on. Standard reconnaissance in force. We move out at 0400. He laid out the plan with brutal simplicity. It was all about speed, aggression, and overwhelming firepower. He talked about fields of fire, infiltration routes, and contingency extraction points. It was a textbook SEAL operation, a hammer looking for a nail. As he spoke, Eris moved away from the wall and approached the hollow table. She didn't speak, but her movement was deliberate enough to draw the eyes of everyone in the room. Valerius stopped mid-sentence, his jaw tightening. "Do you have a problem, Doctor?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "You should not go to the surface," she stated. It was not a suggestion or a warning. It was a declaration of fact. A wave of disbelief washed over the room. Valerius let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me? The resonance I've been tracking has localized," she continued, ignoring his tone. She gestured toward her datapad, and with a few deft swipes, she projected a new layer of information onto the holotable. It was a complex, color-coded map of subsurface energy readings. A faint pulsing lattice of red lines appeared beneath the holographic mountains. "These are not natural seismic precursors. The energy signature is coherent, monochromatic, and phase-locked. It's an artificial field being generated from multiple points. The observatory on Ridgeback Peak is at a geometric nexus of that field. The communications blackout is not the objective. It's a secondary effect of the focused energy. Valerius stared at the strange patterns on his map, his expression a mixture of confusion and contempt. What in God's name are you talking about? Phase-locked? Monochromatic? Speak English, Doctor. I am speaking English, Commander, Eris replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. The mountain is being subjected to a sustained, low-amplitude vibration. The energy is being focused. I believe they are attempting to find this facility's resonant frequency. If they succeed, they can induce a catastrophic structural failure without using a single gram of explosive. They can bring this entire mountain down on top of us. Silence. The concept was so alien, so outside the realm of conventional warfare, that the men in the room could not immediately process it. It sounded like science fiction. Valerius was the first to recover, his disbelief quickly hardening into anger. He saw this as a direct challenge to his authority, a civilian academic trying to tell him how to run his operation. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard, he sneered. A rock and roll weapon? We're being attacked by guitars? You've been underground too long, Doctor. You're seeing ghosts in your machines. He swiped his hand through the air, dismissing her data overlay from the holotable. The red lattice vanished. My men are operators, not geologists. We deal with tangible threats, bombs and bullets, not your voodoo science. He turned his back on her, a clear gesture of public humiliation. As I was saying, he continued, his voice booming with renewed confidence. We move out at 0400. We will find whoever is up there and we will eliminate them. That is how we solve problems, with decisive action. He looked around the table, daring anyone to contradict him. No one did. The department heads looked down, avoiding Eris's gaze. Cutter Diaz watched her for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, before returning his attention to his own console. Eris did not argue. She did not raise her voice or attempt to defend her analysis. She simply stood there for a moment, her face unreadable. In her mind, she was calculating the rate of energy absorption in the granite, the tensile strength of the support structures, the propagation speed of the shear waves she knew were coming. The commander's ego, his rigid adherence to orthodoxy, was just another variable in a complex equation of failure. She gave another one of her infuriatingly small nods, turned, and walked out of the Toh-C, leaving behind a room full of men committed to a course of action that she knew, with mathematical certainty, would lead them directly into a catastrophe. The silence she left in her wake was more damning than any argument she could have made. The attack did not begin with a bang. It began with a hum. It started so low it was felt more than heard, a deep, pervasive thrum that seemed to rise from the very floor of the base. It was the same frequency Aris had been tracking, but amplified 1,000-fold. The low-level vibration that was a constant companion in Kestrel's nest suddenly gained a sinister, focused intent. Cups of coffee on consoles began to tremble, their surfaces rippling in concentric circles. Loose panels in the ceiling started to buzz with a metallic, insect-like sound. The hum grew steadily in volume and intensity, climbing the harmonic scale until it was a solid physical presence in the air, a sound you could feel in your teeth and in your sternum. Then the shaking started. It was not the violent, chaotic jolting of an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, sickening sway, like being in the belly of a massive dying beast. The entire mountain was shuddering, in a slow, deliberate pulse. The lights flickered violently, and the backup generators kicked in with a guttural roar, adding to the cacophony. A fine shower of dust and rock particles rained down from the ceiling, clouding the air. Red emergency strobes began to flash, painting the panicked faces of the crew in hellish, alternating shades of crimson and darkness. "Status report," Valerius bellowed, his voice barely audible over the growing din. He was in the command center, having returned from the talk just moments before. "What is that? Is it an earthquake?" Eris was already at her station, her face illuminated by the green glow of her seismographs. The needles were screaming, redlining off the charts. "It is not an earthquake," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with unnerving calm. "They found the primary resonance. It's a forced harmonic vibration. They are shaking us apart." Panic began to set in. A young technician cried out as a section of the ceiling, a massive chunk of raw gneiss, detached and crashed onto a bank of servers with a deafening explosion of sparks and shattered metal. The rhythmic swaying grew more violent. Men were thrown from their feet, scrambling for handholds on consoles and support pillars. "Find the source," Valerius roared, grabbing a hand mic. "Hammer team, suit up, we're going topside. Cutter, I want triangulation on that energy source now." "Negative, Commander," Cutter yelled back, his hands flying across his own controls. "The interference is off the scale. It's like trying to find a whisper in a hurricane. All our external sensors are blinded. The drone we sent up at 0300 just went dead, shaken right out of the sky." Valerius slammed his fist on the console in frustration. His entire worldview, his entire tactical doctrine, was based on identifying and violently neutralizing a physical enemy. But here, the enemy was the environment itself. The very ground beneath his feet had become the weapon. His methods were useless. He continued to bark orders, seal pressure doors, run damage control, prepare to repel boarders. But they were the reflexive actions of a man confronting a problem he could not comprehend. He was trying to shoot a tidal wave. A deep, groaning crack echoed through the chamber, a sound of immense tearing. A fracture line, glowing with the friction of shearing rock, appeared on the far wall and began to spiderweb its way across the ceiling. The structural support beams, thick plasteel girders that were supposed to withstand a direct nuclear strike, began to bend and deform under the unnatural strain. The rhythmic pulse of the mountain was finding every microscopic weakness, every flaw in the base's construction, and mercilessly exploiting it. They were inside a bell that was being rung by a giant, invisible hand. The failure of orthodoxy was total. Brute force was irrelevant. Aggression was pointless. The commander's authority, built on a foundation of physical dominance and tactical certainty, crumbled along with the granite around him. He was just another terrified man in a box that was being systematically dismantled by an enemy he couldn't see, hear, or fight. The mountain did not care about his rank. Physics did not respect his command. In the midst of the escalating chaos, a single point of stillness remained: Eris Thorne. She had abandoned her own alcove and now stood behind the central command console, her eyes scanning every data feed, every structural integrity sensor, every power distribution schematic. While others saw chaos, she saw a complex but solvable wave mechanics problem. The fear that paralyzed the others was, for her, just another variable to be filtered out. She saw the patterns in the destruction, the nodes and anti-nodes of the vibrational waves sweeping through the facility. She saw the path to a solution. It was a path no one else could see, a solution that defied every instinct of fight or flight. It required not resistance, but harmony. Now. A massive support beam, its structural integrity finally compromised, tore away from the ceiling with a screech of tortured metal. It swung down like a gargantuan pendulum, crushing a row of workstations before embedding itself in the far wall. The air was thick with choking dust. The rhythmic, destructive pulse intensified, and a collective moan of despair rose from the surviving crew. Valerius was pressed against a bulkhead, his face ashen, his shouted orders lost in the cacophony. He was paralyzed. His entire world had been reduced to a simple, brutal equation he could not solve, and his system had crashed. It was in this moment of absolute paralysis that Eris moved. She walked with a calm, deliberate gait that seemed impossible amidst the violent shaking, her body moving in counter-rhythm to the mountain's death throes. She reached the main command console, where the terrified on-duty officer was frozen, his hands hovering uselessly over the controls. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple, firm gesture. He flinched, then looked up at her. Her eyes were clear, focused, and utterly devoid of panic. She did not speak. She simply held his gaze, and he seemed to draw a measure of calm from her impossible stillness. He nodded, unstrapped himself, and stumbled away from the chair. Eris slid into the command seat. Her fingers flew across the holographic interface, a blur of motion. She was not just typing, she was sculpting with data, her movements precise and economical. She bypassed security protocols and accessed the base's deepest systems, her commands flowing with an authority that transcended rank. Authority did not need to be seized. In a moment of true crisis, it simply flowed like water seeking its level to the single point of competence in the room. "Cutter," she said, her voice not raised, yet it cut through the roar of the dying mountain with absolute clarity. Petty Officer Diaz, who had been trying to re-establish a link with the outside world, looked up. He saw her at the command console, saw the look of total concentration on her face, and a decision was made in the space of a heartbeat. He had seen his commander's failure. He now saw the only alternative. "Give me master control of the primary communications array," Eris commanded. "All 12 surface dishes, and I need to slave the deep Earth seismic survey emitters to this console. I need their full power output, now." A bellow of rage erupted from across the room. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Valerius screamed, pushing himself off the bulkhead. "Get away from that console. That is a direct order." Cutter did not even look at his commander. His eyes were locked on Eris. Her plan was insane. The comms array was for communication, the seismic emitters for geological surveys. Using them at full power, in this state, could overload the base's power core. It was a violation of every protocol he had ever learned. But protocol had failed. The commander had failed. He looked at the cracking ceiling, then back at the impossible calm of the woman in the command chair. He chose logic over the flawed leadership he had been trained to obey. "Yes, ma'am," Cutter said, his voice firm. He turned to his own station, his fingers flying, rerouting terawatts of power and gigabytes of control data. The system access codes flashed across his screen. "Access granted, Thorn, A oversight, Cadmus." He didn't know what Cadmus meant, but the system recognized her authority. He did not hesitate. Valerius stumbled toward them, his face contorted with fury and disbelief. "Diaz, I will have you court-martialed. I am in command here." "No, you are not," Aris said, her eyes never leaving the data streams she was manipulating. "You are a passenger. Please brace for impact." The finality in her tone was absolute. The other SEALs, who had been trying to secure loose equipment, paused. They looked from their bellowing commander to the quiet woman at the console, and then to Cutter, who was now working in perfect sync with her. The hierarchy had inverted. Competence was now the only rank that mattered. "They are playing the mountain like an instrument," Eris explained, her voice a clipped, dispassionate lecture delivered at the end of the world. Her hands moved in a constant, fluid dance across the controls, adjusting frequencies, power levels, and phase angles. The main holo screen, which had been displaying a chaotic damage control overlay, now showed a complex wave interaction model. A violent, jagged red wave, the enemy's attack, dominated the display. "Their weapon is not a bomb. It is a tuning fork, a harmonic resonator. If we try to find and destroy the source, it will be like smashing the instrument. The note will still ring. The destructive resonance will continue until the entire structure fails. We cannot stop the note." A fresh tremor, more violent than any before, shook the room. A large section of the ceiling collapsed, and the lights on one side of the command center went out completely, plunging half the room into darkness lit only by the flashing red strobes. "Then what are you doing?" Cutter yelled over the noise, his eyes fixed on his power level readouts. The seismic emitters were drawing catastrophic amounts of energy from the core. "I am not stopping the note," Eris replied. A second wave, this one a brilliant blue, appearing on the holo screen, generated by her inputs. "I am playing a new one, destructive interference, a counter song. If I can match their frequency and amplitude perfectly, but invert the phase, the two waves will cancel each other out." The concept was elegant, brilliant, and terrifyingly precise. It was a scalpel of pure physics aimed at the heart of the crisis. But the risk was astronomical. If she was even a fraction of a degree out of phase, or if her amplitude was wrong, she would not cancel the enemy's wave. She would amplify it. She would become the instrument of their own destruction, delivering the final, killing blow herself. For a few agonizing seconds, the shaking intensified. The blue wave on the screen slammed into the red one, and the resulting waveform became a chaotic, terrifying spike. The entire base screamed, a symphony of shearing metal and fracturing rock. Valerius was thrown to the floor. "You're killing us!" he shrieked, his voice thin with terror. "You mad woman, you're killing us all!" The other SEALs braced themselves, their faces grim, accepting the end. Eris ignored them all. Her focus narrowed to a single point, a single variable on her screen, the phase lock indicator. It was fluctuating wildly. She needed it to be stable, perfectly stable. Her right hand made infinitesimal adjustments to a virtual slider, her brow furrowed in concentration. The fate of everyone in the mountain rested on the steadiness of her hand and the precision of her calculations. The noise rose to an unbearable, deafening crescendo. It felt like the tectonic plates themselves were grinding together directly beneath their feet. Perfect. She tapped a single icon on her screen labeled Engage. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The world-ending shriek of tortured matter did not fade away. It was not dampened. It was simply gone. It was as if the universe's master volume control had been slammed to zero. The violent rhythmic shaking ceased in the space of a single heartbeat. The only sounds that remained were the dripping of water from a broken pipe, the low hum of the emergency power, and the ragged, disbelieving gasps of the survivors. a profound cathedral-like silence descended upon the command center. It was a silence that was heavier and more shocking than the noise it had replaced. Dust, thick and white as snow, hung in the air, catching the beams of the few remaining lights in ethereal shafts. Men slowly, cautiously, picked themselves up from the floor, looking around at the devastation with wide, stunned eyes. The base was a wreck. Equipment was smashed. The walls were scarred with massive cracks, but it was holding. They were alive. They all stared at Eris. She was still seated in the command chair, her hands resting calmly on the console. The hollow screen before her showed two perfectly opposing waves, the red and the blue, flowing into one another and creating a flat, serene line. A perfect cancellation. She had not used a weapon. She had used physics. She had met a symphony of destruction with a single, perfect note of silence. The threat was not just neutralized, it was nullified, erased from existence. It was a checkmate moment, an intellectual triumph so complete and so elegant that it defied the very nature of the violent, kinetic world these soldiers inhabited. The silence was her victory cry. In the stunned aftermath, as the dust began to slowly settle, Valerius staggered to his feet. He was covered in a fine white powder, a bleeding cut on his forehead, tracing a crimson line through the grime. His authority was as shattered as the base around him. He stared at Eris, his expression a chaotic storm of fury, humiliation, and a dawning, terrifying confusion. He opened his mouth, perhaps to reassert the command he had so completely lost, but before he could speak, a single piercing tone cut through the quiet. A priority communication request. Cutter, his face streaked with sweat and dust, turned to his console. "Sir, I mean ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a new, profound respect. "It's a direct channel from SOCOM, quantum encrypted. It's Admiral Garrett." The name hung in the air, a testament to the gravity of the situation. Admiral Garrett was the supreme commander of all special operations, a 4-star legend who rarely, if ever, involved himself in the affairs of a single FRB. Valerius paled. Eris, however, simply nodded. "Put him on the main screen." The massive hollow screen flickered to life, and the stern, weathered face of Admiral Garrett appeared, rendered in shimmering blue light. His expression was grim, his eyes seeming to take in the entire scene of devastation in a single, sweeping glance. "Report," he commanded, his voice a low gravel that carried immense weight. Valerius stepped forward, instinctively trying to reclaim his role. "Admiral, this is Lieutenant Commander Valerius. We were hit by an unconventional enemy weapon, but the situation is under control." Garrett's eyes narrowed, cutting Valerius off mid-sentence. "Not you, Commander," the Admiral said, his voice cold as the void. "Her." His gaze shifted, locking directly onto Eris in the command chair. The public rebuke was so sharp, so absolute, that Valerius physically recoiled as if struck. Eris met the Admiral's gaze without flinching. She gave her report in the same calm, economical tone she had used throughout the crisis. "Hostile resonance weapon neutralized via phase-inverted harmonic cancellation. The external emitters are still active, but their attack is now ineffective. Base integrity is critically compromised, but holding. Threat remains, but is currently searching for a new frequency. We are blind, but we are safe for the moment." Admiral Garrett listened, nodding slowly. A flicker of something that might have been relief crossed his features. "As expected," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Well done, Aris." He then pinned Valerius with a glare that was pure ice. "Commander, you are hereby relieved of command, effective immediately. You will surrender your sidearm and command credentials to Petty Officer Diaz. You had a ghost in your house, and you treated her like a janitor. Your career is over. We will discuss the full extent of your failure when you are debriefed at Fleet Command." Valerius was stunned into silence, his face a mask of disbelief. "A ghost, sir? She's a civilian geologist," he stammered, gesturing weakly toward Eris. It was then that another voice spoke, quiet and filled with a sudden, dawning awe. It was Chief Petty Officer Davies, the oldest and most experienced member of the SEAL team, a man they called Pops. He had been staring intently at Eris's left wrist, which had been exposed when her sleeve was pushed back as she worked the console. "That tattoo," Pops whispered, his voice hoarse. The other 4 SEALs, Valerius included, turned to look. On the pale skin of her inner wrist was a small, intricate design inked in black. It was a complex geometric pattern, a stylized sine wave intersecting a perfect crystalline lattice structure. It was elegant, precise, and utterly unfamiliar. Pops took a half step forward, his eyes wide. "My mother," he said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "She had the same one. She was a signals analyst during the Cold War. Or that's what she told us." He looked from the tattoo to Eris's face, a quarter-century of buried memories and unanswered questions suddenly coalescing into a shocking revelation. She was with the Cadmus Group, Geophysical Warfare Division. They said it was a myth, a black project that never existed. The silence in the room became absolute. The 5 hardened operators, men who had faced down every conceivable horror of modern warfare, went completely still. They looked at the small tattoo, then at the unassuming woman who wore it, and the impossible truth settled over them, heavier and more solid than the thousands of tons of rock above their heads. The Cadmus Group, a ghost story whispered in the highest echelons of intelligence. A rumored directorate of scientists and strategists who studied how to weaponize the planet itself. They were the ones who wrote the book on this kind of warfare. Eris met the old chief's gaze. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was confirmation enough. She was not just a geologist. She was a legacy. She was the inheritor of a secret knowledge, a guardian of a terrible and powerful science. The name on the access logs that Cutter had seen, Thorn, A. Oversight, Cadmus, was not just a security clearance. It was a bloodline. She was the daughter of Cassandra Thorn, the physicist who had founded the Cadmus Group, the woman who had predicted the dawn of geophysical warfare and, in secret, had developed the only known defense against it. She hadn't just studied how to stop this attack. She had been raised by the woman who wrote the doctrine. Valerius stared, his mind finally comprehending the scale of his arrogance. He had not just dismissed a scientist. He had insulted a living legend. His fall from power was swift and silent. Cutter approached him, his face grim, and held out his hand. Without a word, Valerius unholstered his sidearm and placed it in the petty officer's palm. The transfer of power was complete. The aftermath was defined by a new and profound quiet. The frantic energy of the crisis was replaced by a methodical, focused calm, orchestrated by Aris from the command chair. The remaining crew, and especially the SEALs of Hammer Team, moved with a newfound purpose and an almost religious reverence for the woman they had so recently dismissed. Her quiet suggestions were treated as immutable commands. They followed her instructions for reinforcing the weakened sections of the base, for rebooting the sensor arrays in a way that would shield them from residual harmonic interference, and for tracking the faint, frustrated signature of the enemy weapon as it probed for a new vulnerability that would never be found. Valerius was confined to his quarters, a disgraced and broken man awaiting his inevitable transport to face the consequences of his hubris. The SEALs, once a unit defined by their commander's aggressive certainty, were now a different kind of team. They were quieter, more observant. They watched Eris work, trying to comprehend the sheer depth of her knowledge. Pops Davies, in particular, rarely left her side, not to speak, but simply to observe, as if trying to honor the memory of his mother by bearing witness to her legacy. Hours later, as Eris was finalizing the stabilization protocols, Cutter Diaz approached her console. He didn't speak. He simply placed a nutrient paste packet and a canteen of purified water beside her keyboard. It was a small, simple gesture, a subordinate offering sustenance to a superior. But in the silent, meritocratic order that had been forged in the crucible of the crisis, it was an act of fealty, an acknowledgement of her absolute authority. Eris paused her work, looked at the offering, and then at Cutter. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. It was the first hint of warmth, of human connection she had displayed. For Cutter, it felt like a commendation from a god. When the first relief and engineering teams finally arrived 2 days later, they found a base that was battered but stable, its crew exhausted but disciplined. They also found that Dr. Eris Thorne was gone. She had taken a spot on the first evac transport, a small gray figure with a single duffel bag, slipping away as quietly and unobtrusively as she had arrived. She left no final report, no forwarding address, no parting words. She left only a saved facility, a humbled commander, and 5 special operators who would forever carry the story of the day the mountain sang a song of destruction, and the quiet woman who taught it a lullaby of silence. Her purpose was fulfilled, the equation solved. For Eris Thorne, there was nothing else left to do. She was a force of nature in her own right, as quiet, as powerful, and as misunderstood as the deep tectonic plates she navigated. She moved through the world not seeking recognition or authority, but simply imposing order on chaos, balancing the violent equations of men with the elegant, irrefutable laws of the universe. She was a ghost, a legend, a daughter carrying the weight of a secret legacy, forever listening to the whispers of the earth, waiting for the next discordant note that would require her unique and terrible harmony.